You sit down to work. You know what you need to do. The document is open. You have time. Nothing is stopping you. And then, almost automatically, you check your phone. Nothing important. Back to work. A few sentences later, another tab. Then your email. Then something you suddenly remember you need to look up. 10 minutes later, you've been busy the entire time, but almost nothing has happened. So you make the obvious diagnosis. I can't focus anymore. But what if that's not actually what happened? What if you haven't lost your ability to focus? What if you've simply trained your brain to do something else? And if that's true, trying harder may be one of the least effective ways to fix it. For years, Gloria Mark, a researcher at the University of California, Irvine, has studied how people actually use their attention while working with computers. Not how we think we work, how we actually work. Her research has produced a number that is difficult to forget. In her more recent observations, people spent an average of about 47 seconds on one screen before shifting their attention somewhere else. 47 seconds. That doesn't mean the human brain is physically incapable of concentrating beyond 47 seconds. Obviously it can. People read novels, surgeons perform operations, musicians practice the same passage for an hour. The interesting question is different. Why are we switching so often when nobody is forcing us to? We usually imagine distraction as an external event. A notification appears, someone interrupts us, the phone rings, and sometimes that's exactly what happens. But Mark's work points towards something more uncomfortable. A significant amount of interruption is self-generated. We interrupt ourselves. You can probably watch this happen. You're working on something mildly difficult. There's a moment of uncertainty. Maybe you don't know how to phrase the next sentence. Maybe the spreadsheet requires more thought than you expected, and your hand moves toward the phone, or your cursor moves toward another tab. No notification was necessary. The difficult moment itself became the trigger. That's an important distinction, because if distraction were only caused by notifications, the solution would be easy. Turn them off. But if you've learned to escape whenever work becomes uncomfortable, silence alone doesn't solve the problem. You can put your phone on Do Not Disturb and still find 20 other ways not to think. There was a time when multitasking sounded impressive. You'd see it in job descriptions. Excellent multitasking skills. It suggested efficiency, the ability to handle several things at once. But most cognitively demanding multitasking isn't really doing several things simultaneously. It's switching task A, task B, back to A, message, back to A, email, back to B. The switches can happen so quickly that they feel simultaneous, but the brain has to repeatedly reorient itself. Psychologists have studied these switching costs for decades. The basic finding is remarkably consistent. When we alternate between demanding tasks, there is a cognitive cost to the transition. The American Psychological Association summarizes research showing that even brief switches can accumulate into substantial losses of productive time. Think about what that means for an ordinary morning. You spend 30 minutes writing, except you don't. You spend 30 minutes moving in and out of writing. Those are not the same thing. Imagine trying to drive somewhere while repeatedly taking random exits from the highway. Each exit might take only a minute. The problem isn't just the minute. You have to slow down, leave the road, turn around, merge back into traffic and recover your previous speed. Attention works somewhat like that. The interruption is visible. The recovery is mostly invisible. And that's why a day can feel exhausting even when surprisingly little meaningful work gets finished. You weren't doing nothing. You were paying switching costs all day. At this point, the story seems obvious. Smartphones destroyed our attention. Delete social media. Buy a notebook. Move to a cabin, problem solved. Except the evidence is more interesting than that. There is good evidence that phones and notifications can interfere with attention. Experiments have found that notifications can impair performance even when people don't actually respond to them. Some studies have gone further and found worse attention performance when a person's smartphone was merely present. But this is where we need to be careful. Research on the mere presence effect isn't perfectly consistent. Some experiments find it, others don't. A 2023 paper Reviewing that disagreement found evidence for reduced attention in its experiment, while also acknowledging previous studies that failed to replicate the effect. That's useful, because "your phone is destroying your brain" is a great headline. It's just not a very precise explanation. The phone isn't magical. What's remarkable about it is what it contains: messages, news, work, games, video, music, social approval, novelty, potential emergencies, potential opportunities, potential romantic interest, and an effectively endless supply of things you haven't seen yet. Human beings have always been distractible. We just never carried this much potential distraction in our pockets. Imagine two buttons. The first button gives you exactly the same result every time you press it. The second might give you something interesting. Usually it doesn't, but sometimes it does. Which button are you going to feel more tempted to press? The second one. This is part of what makes checking behavior so persistent. When you open your inbox, you don't know what's waiting. When you refresh a feed, you don't know what the next post will be. When you check a message, it could be meaningless or it could matter enormously. Uncertainty itself creates anticipation. Now compare that with the task you're supposed to be doing: writing a report, studying, editing, building a presentation, learning something difficult. The reward from those activities is usually delayed. The discomfort is immediate. Your phone offers almost the reverse arrangement. The effort is tiny. The possibility of reward is immediate. And we've placed these two options beside each other. Then we wonder why willpower struggles. This is one reason James Clear's argument in Atomic Habits is so useful. We tend to imagine behavior as a referendum on character. A disciplined person resists. An undisciplined person gives in. But behavior is heavily influenced by cues, friction, and environment. If the distraction requires one movement of your thumb, while meaningful work requires 20 minutes before it becomes satisfying, you're not designing a fair contest. You're asking willpower to compensate for bad architecture. And willpower is expensive. Environment is cheap. Here's the part I think we underestimate. Suppose every time you experience boredom, you reach for stimulation. Waiting for an elevator, phone. Standing in line, phone. Commercial break, phone. Friend goes to the bathroom, phone. 30 seconds before a meeting starts, phone. Even walking from the car into a building can apparently require entertainment now. None of these moments seems important, but together they may be teaching you something. Never remain unstimulated. The instant the world becomes slightly boring, change the channel. Then at 9 o'clock Monday morning, you ask the same brain to sit quietly with one difficult problem for 90 minutes, and you're surprised that it protests. This is where the usual productivity advice gets the order wrong. We think focus is something we turn on when work begins. But the ability to focus may also depend on what we do when we're not working. If every empty moment is filled, boredom starts to feel abnormal. And deep work contains a lot of boredom. Reading a difficult paper isn't constantly exciting. Writing isn't constantly exciting. Programming isn't constantly exciting. Building a business isn't constantly exciting. Even work you love contains long stretches where nothing particularly stimulating happens. There is a paragraph that won't cooperate, a bug you can't find, a concept you don't understand, a decision without an obvious answer. That uncomfortable gap is often where valuable thinking begins. It's also where we've trained ourselves to leave. Think about the last time you did serious work. There was probably a moment when the task became harder than expected. Watch what happens at that exact moment. Your brain produces a surprisingly persuasive list of alternatives. Maybe I should check email first. Maybe I need coffee. Actually, I should research this. I wonder if they replied. Let me just check one thing. The important phrase is just one thing, because distraction rarely introduces itself honestly. Nobody thinks, I'd like to destroy the next 35 minutes of concentration. It arrives as something reasonable, a tiny administrative task, a harmless check, a useful search, and occasionally it really is useful. That's what makes the habit difficult to detect. The question isn't whether checking email is bad. The question is, why did you suddenly feel the need to check it precisely when your current task became difficult? That's a much more revealing question. Sometimes what we call distraction is actually avoidance wearing business clothes. There's another reason those tiny escapes matter. Attention has momentum. When you're deeply engaged in something, continuing can become relatively easy. The hardest part is often getting there. You may have experienced this with reading. The first 10 minutes feel restless. Then something changes. 30 minutes later, somebody speaks to you and you almost resent returning to the room. Nothing mystical happened. Your attention settled. The problem with frequent switching is that you keep restarting the settling process. You never stay long enough to reach the quieter state on the other side of restlessness. So you conclude, I can't focus, but perhaps you never gave focus enough uninterrupted time to appear. That's different. Researchers studying workplace interruptions have also found something counterintuitive. People sometimes compensate for interruptions by working faster, which sounds good, until you look at the other side of the equation. In a well-known UC Irvine study, interrupted workers completed tasks faster in some conditions, but interruptions were also associated with greater stress, frustration, effort, and time pressure. In other words, humans are surprisingly good at adapting to fragmented work. We can become faster, more responsive, better at juggling, and feel terrible doing it. Efficiency and focus are not the same thing. Probably not. And this is where I disagree with the most dramatic version of the attention crisis story. If human attention was simply collapsing, it would be difficult to explain why the same person who can't read a report for 20 minutes can watch a 2-hour movie, or play a game for 3 hours, or spend an entire evening researching a hobby. The capacity is still there. What's changed is the competition. Your work isn't competing against nothing anymore. It's competing against some of the most frictionless sources of novelty ever created, and many of them are within arm's reach. This changes how I think about the problem. Maybe the goal isn't to become a person with superhuman concentration. Maybe the goal is to stop making concentration unnecessarily difficult. That requires a different strategy, not more motivation, less competition. Start with something almost embarrassingly simple. When you want to do serious work, put the phone somewhere you cannot reach without standing up. Not face down, not beside the keyboard, not 6 inches farther away, somewhere else, a drawer, a bag, another room. The point isn't moral purity, it's friction. You want distraction to require a conscious action, because right now, for many people, distraction happens before a conscious decision has even formed. Next, choose one target, not work, something observable. Write the first 500 words, review these 20 pages, finish this model, solve this section. Chris Bailey makes a useful distinction in hyperfocus. Attention becomes more manageable when you deliberately choose what deserves it. That sounds obvious. It isn't. Most people begin work surrounded by competing definitions of what they should be doing. The inbox says one thing, Slack says another, the browser says another. The to-do list has 17 opinions. Focus requires exclusion. When you choose one thing, you're also deciding what you're willing to ignore. That's the harder half. Then give yourself a protected interval. 25 minutes is fine, 45 is fine, an hour is fine. Don't become religious about the number. The Pomodoro technique is useful not because 25 minutes possesses some neurological magic. It works because it creates a boundary. For this period, this is the only thing that exists. And here's the part people skip. When you feel the urge to escape, don't immediately obey it. Notice it. That's the training. You're writing. You suddenly want to check something. Don't wait. The urge often feels urgent without actually being important. You are teaching yourself that an impulse does not require an action. That's a far more transferable skill than installing another productivity app. There is one more experiment worth trying, and it has nothing to do with work. Once or twice a day, do something without adding stimulation. Walk without headphones. Wait in line without your phone. Drink coffee without opening anything. Sit somewhere for 10 minutes. This will feel absurdly unproductive. That's partly the point. You're practicing staying in one attentional state without immediately reaching for another. Think of it as resistance training for boredom. You don't need to become a monk. You don't need to hate technology, and you certainly don't need to eliminate every enjoyable distraction from your life. The objective isn't deprivation, it's choice. You want to be able to use stimulation because you chose it, rather than because 30 seconds of silence became intolerable. This brings us back to where we started. You sit down. The document is open. A few minutes pass. Then the familiar urge appears. Check the phone. Open the tab. Look at email. Do something easier. Previously, that moment looked like evidence. Evidence that you weren't disciplined. Evidence that you were procrastinating. Evidence that something was wrong with your attention span. Now you can interpret it differently. It's a habit asking to be completed. And habits can be retrained. The most important productivity system may not be your calendar. It may not be your task manager. It may not be your morning routine. It may be the environment you create around your attention, because your attention is constantly learning what you expect from it. Switch every 40 seconds, and switching becomes normal. Escape boredom immediately, and boredom becomes unbearable. Keep distraction within reach, and resisting it becomes part of the job. But remove some of those exits. Stay with the difficult paragraph a little longer. Let yourself occasionally be bored. And something interesting begins to happen. Focus stops feeling like a battle you have to win every morning. It starts becoming the default again. Maybe you didn't lose your ability to focus. Maybe you've just been practicing something else. And if that's true, the solution isn't to try harder. It's to start practicing differently.